The human stopped the predator's heart with his bare hands, and somehow that was the exact moment he saved its life. If you had told me that sentence was true before the flood on Vera 9, I would have laughed in your face. I had served as a senior emergency medic for 19 standard years, and I knew exactly how every rescue involving a Caraxi Leopard ended. It never ended with survivors standing calmly on the riverbank. It certainly never ended with a human becoming the only creature that monster would trust. The storm had swallowed half the valley before dawn. Rain hammered the rescue skimmers so hard that even our navigation sensors struggled to separate water from land. The river had burst through 2 containment walls, turning an entire mining district into a roaring black current filled with shattered cargo containers, broken bridges, and uprooted steel towers. Every emergency channel carried the same warning: stay away from the flooded basin. A Caraxi predator had been spotted in the water. Even trained security teams refused to approach. We all knew the stories. Caraxi did not panic. They hunted. They waited. They never released prey once their jaws locked. Then the human arrived. His name was Daniel Hayes. No armor. No military insignia. Just a weathered rescue jacket, a coil of climbing rope over one shoulder, and the calm expression of someone arriving for an ordinary shift instead of a disaster. I remember staring at him because he looked completely out of place. Around him, experienced alien officers argued over evacuation routes while automated drones circled overhead searching for movement. Daniel never raised his voice. He simply studied the river for a few seconds, then pointed toward a whirlpool nearly 80 yards downstream. There, he said quietly. Something's trapped. One of the security officers followed his gaze through a scanner and immediately stiffened. That's the predator, he shouted. Nobody goes near it. Another officer lifted an ion rifle. One clean shot, and this problem is over. Daniel stepped directly into the line of fire before anyone could squeeze the trigger. You fire, he said without taking his eyes off the river, and you'll hit something you haven't even seen yet. Nobody understood what he meant. Honestly, I assumed he was simply another reckless human convinced courage could replace common sense. Before anyone could stop him, he dropped the rope, sprinted across the collapsing dock, and dove into water cold enough to shut down most nervous systems in minutes. The current slammed him against floating debris almost immediately. Even from shore, I could see twisted beams spinning around him like giant blades driven by the flood. Every rescue drone predicted the same outcome. Fatal probability exceeded 90%. Daniel ignored every warning. He disappeared beneath the surface, resurfaced farther downstream, then vanished again as another wave swallowed him. The Caraxi finally emerged only 30 feet away. Massive black shoulders cut through the water. Silver markings flashed beneath the rain. Its head barely remained above the surface as broken cables wrapped tightly around its chest, dragging it toward the flooded remains of an industrial tower. The officers around me reached for their weapons again. Daniel reached for the predator instead. The river swallowed both of them before anyone on the shoreline could even shout another warning. I watched the rescue monitors lose Daniel Hayes almost instantly as sheets of muddy water rolled over his head. The current slammed the Caraxi against the twisted remains of a cargo support tower, tightening the heavy cables around its chest every few seconds. It was not struggling to escape anymore. It was conserving what little strength it had left. Daniel reached it just before another surge pushed them beneath the surface again. Instead of grabbing the animal's neck, he wrapped one arm around the steel cable and planted both boots against a bent support beam. Every movement was measured. Every motion looked practiced. The cable shifted only an inch at first, then another. Finally, it snapped free from the crushed tower with a metallic crack that even I could hear above the storm. The predator exploded upward with terrifying speed. Every officer beside me shouted the same prediction. The human was finished. The Caraxi swung its enormous head toward Daniel, opened its jaws, and lunged. Daniel did not swim away. He slipped sideways with remarkable precision, letting the current carry him just far enough to avoid the strike before placing both hands against the animal's shoulder and redirecting its momentum. Instead of colliding with him, the predator spun harmlessly through the rushing water and crashed into a floating section of broken platform. It immediately turned again, not because it wanted revenge, because panic had replaced instinct. I had treated frightened patients from dozens of species before, and fear always looked the same. Fast breathing, unfocused movement, desperate reactions. Daniel recognized it immediately. He reached for the animal again, speaking calmly despite the roaring flood. I could not hear every word through the rain, but one sentence reached our audio receivers. Easy. I am not leaving. Somehow those words slowed the predator more than any restraint could have. The Caraxi hesitated for a fraction of a second before another violent whirlpool pulled both of them toward the remains of the submerged industrial complex. That was when Daniel looked beneath the surface instead of toward shore. His expression changed. It was subtle, but unmistakable. He was no longer focused on rescuing the predator. He had found something else. Without warning, he took a deep breath and disappeared underwater. The Caraxi followed immediately, not as a hunter chasing prey, but as though it already understood where the human intended to go. Our scanners struggled to penetrate the swirling sediment, showing only broken outlines beneath nearly 20 feet of floodwater. Then a faint emergency beacon appeared. It pulsed once every 3 seconds from inside a collapsed transport vessel buried beneath twisted steel. One of our engineers whispered that the beacon should have been impossible to detect through that much debris. Daniel somehow found it without instruments. Moments later, the rescue drones captured a clearer image. The Caraxi was no longer trying to escape the wreckage. It was circling a single section of the damaged hull over and over again, refusing to leave. Even as the current battered its exhausted body, Daniel reached the fractured observation window and pressed one hand against the cracked glass. His eyes widened for the first time since entering the river. Whatever waited inside that flooded compartment had convinced both the most feared predator on Vera and the calmest human I had ever met that walking away was no longer an option. The fractured window held just long enough for Daniel to study the compartment beyond it. Through the cloudy water, I could barely make out the outline of a small figure curled beneath a collapsed console, while warning lights blinked weakly through the darkness. The emergency beacon had not been calling for soldiers. It had been calling for anyone willing to listen. Daniel glanced toward the Caraxi. The great predator had stopped circling. Instead, it floated almost motionless beside the damaged hull, watching the trapped compartment with complete focus. Every terrifying story I had ever heard about that species suddenly felt incomplete. Predators hunted. This one was standing guard. Daniel reached into a pocket on his rescue jacket and pulled out a compact hydraulic spreader no larger than his forearm. It was designed for damaged escape vehicles, not crushed alien transport ships buried beneath 20 feet of floodwater. Even so, he anchored himself against the twisted frame and searched carefully for the weakest point in the cracked hatch instead of forcing the entire door open. That decision probably saved everyone inside. The moment the tool expanded, a warning flashed across our rescue display. Internal defense system active. Before anyone on shore could relay the alert, 3 compact security drones emerged from hidden compartments inside the transport vessel. Their sensors had mistaken Daniel for an intruder. Thin beams of scanning light swept through the water as the drones accelerated toward him. The officers beside me shouted for him to retreat, but retreat would have abandoned whoever remained trapped inside. Daniel stayed exactly where he was. He released the hydraulic tool, caught the first drone with both hands, and redirected it into the path of the second. Both machines spun harmlessly into the damaged ceiling while the third attempted to block his access to the hatch. Instead of striking it directly, Daniel twisted a loose emergency cable free from the wreckage and looped it around the drone just as the current surged again. The flood itself pulled the machine into a bent support beam where its systems shut down without a single explosion. Everything happened in seconds. No wasted movement. No panic. No unnecessary force. The Caraxi never interfered. It simply watched Daniel solve one problem after another as though it had already decided this human understood something every other rescuer had missed. With the drones disabled, Daniel returned to the hatch. This time the damaged locking mechanism finally gave way. The compartment remained sealed just enough to prevent a violent rush of water. He eased the opening wider inch by inch until he could reach inside. A small hand reached back almost immediately. Daniel secured the frightened child against his rescue harness before carefully guiding her through the opening. She looked no older than 8 by human standards. Her pale violet skin and silver-white hair marked her as someone from a diplomatic bloodline, not a military family. Even through the water, her expression remained calm, although exhaustion filled her eyes. Then she saw the Caraxi waiting only a few feet away. Instead of showing fear, she stretched one hand toward the great predator. The animal lowered its head without hesitation. Daniel looked from the child to the silent guardian, and for the first time I realized he had not rescued a dangerous beast. He had uncovered a promise that had survived a flood, a shipwreck, and every terrible assumption the rest of us had been willing to believe. Daniel secured the young girl against his rescue harness and pushed away from the shattered transport, just as another powerful surge swept through the flooded valley. The Caraxi stayed close, swimming beside them with steady determination instead of the wild desperation I had expected from a creature that had nearly drowned only minutes earlier. It was protecting their escape route as carefully as Daniel protected the child. That impossible partnership should have been enough to change every mind on the shoreline. It was not. The first rescue shuttle descended through the rain with its floodlights cutting across the river. For one hopeful second, I believed reinforcements had finally arrived to help. Then the external speakers came alive. Release the predator immediately. Surrender the survivor for official custody. There was no concern for the injured child. There was no request for a medical evaluation. The order focused entirely on taking control. Daniel looked toward the hovering shuttle, but did not change course. He kept guiding the girl toward the nearest stretch of stable ground, while the Caraxi remained between them and the approaching aircraft. The security commander leaned farther out of the open side door. Human, step away from the animal. That creature destroyed a diplomatic convoy. You are interfering with an active operation. Daniel answered without raising his voice. Then explain why it stayed behind to protect a child instead of escaping. Silence followed. It lasted only a second, but it told me more than any official report ever had. The commander never answered the question. Instead, several armored officers jumped into the shallow edge of the flood and advanced toward Daniel. They carried restraint equipment designed for dangerous wildlife, but they spread out in a formation that also blocked the child from reaching our medical station. Daniel noticed it immediately. He gently lowered the girl onto a floating rescue platform and tightened the safety straps around her. Stay here, he said calmly. You are safe now. The officers continued forward. One reached for the restraint launcher while another attempted to circle behind the Caraxi. The great predator responded with a deep warning growl that echoed across the flooded valley, but it never charged. It waited. Daniel stepped forward instead. The first officer lunged to grab his shoulder. Daniel shifted sideways with remarkable balance, guiding the officer safely past him before removing the restraint device from the surprised alien's hands in one smooth motion. A second officer rushed in, only to lose footing on the rain-soaked metal beneath the rushing water. Daniel caught the officer before he could fall into the current and pushed him back towards solid footing. Even while defending himself, he refused to let anyone get hurt. The remaining officers hesitated. None of their training had prepared them for someone who could outmaneuver every move without answering aggression with unnecessary force. Behind Daniel, the Caraxi remained perfectly still, watching only him. It did not need commands. It was reading his decisions. Then the little girl finally found enough strength to speak. Her quiet voice carried farther than the storm itself. Do not trust them, she whispered. They were the ones chasing us. Every officer froze. Daniel slowly turned toward the commander above the river, and for the first time since this rescue began, I saw uncertainty appear on the faces of those who claimed they already knew the truth. The commander's silence lasted only a heartbeat before every communication channel filled with overlapping orders. Rescue personnel were instructed to secure the child, isolate the human, and capture the Caraxi before anyone could ask another question. I finally understood why Daniel Hayes had ignored official instructions from the very beginning. He had been watching people instead of uniforms. The little girl reached weakly into her soaked jacket and pulled out a small crystal data capsule no larger than a house key. Even through the rain, I recognized the diplomatic seal glowing inside its transparent core. Every major negotiation on Vera used those encrypted recorders. They could not be altered without leaving permanent evidence. Daniel accepted the capsule but did not examine it. Instead, he slipped it into a waterproof compartment inside his rescue vest and looked directly at the child. We get you somewhere safe first, he said. Everything else comes after. The girl nodded. My name is Lyra Vane, she whispered. My father said if anything happened, never let them have this. Before Daniel could respond, a deep mechanical hum echoed across the valley. Another containment wall upstream had begun to fail. Flood sensors flashed. Red across every rescue display. Thousands of tons of water were about to surge through the narrow canyon, separating our position from higher ground. The nearest evacuation route would disappear within minutes. Daniel scanned the landscape once, measuring distance, current, and elevation with astonishing speed. Then he looked toward the Caraxi. The great predator slowly lowered itself until its broad back was level with the floating rescue platform. At first I thought exhaustion had finally overcome the animal. Then Daniel carefully lifted Lyra and secured her onto the Caraxi using sections of his own climbing rope. Every officer watching gasped in disbelief. No one in recorded history had ever approached a conscious Caraxi that closely without protective barriers, much less placed a child upon its back. The predator remained perfectly still. When Daniel tightened the final knot, the animal briefly turned its head and touched the girl's hand with remarkable gentleness before looking back at the human as if waiting for the next decision. That single moment shattered decades of accepted belief. The Caraxi had not been tamed. It had chosen to trust him. The commander finally lost his patience. He ordered another security team to block the narrow service bridge leading toward higher ground. Daniel saw the movement immediately. He stepped into the rushing water ahead of the Caraxi, forcing the approaching officers to stop without ever raising a weapon. One determined officer rushed forward with an electronic restraint pole, hoping to force Daniel aside. Daniel calmly caught the extended pole, redirected its momentum, and planted its tip harmlessly into the soft riverbank where it locked itself in place. Another officer attempted to flank him, but the unstable ground gave way beneath his boots. Daniel reached out instinctively, pulling the surprised officer back on a solid footing before continuing forward without slowing down. Even the people trying to stop him were safer because of him. No one on our side understood what we were witnessing anymore. The human was protecting the child, protecting the predator, and somehow protecting the very officers standing in his way. As the roar of the approaching flood grew louder behind us, I realized something that still unsettles me today. Daniel Hayes was no longer reacting to danger. He was leading every living soul in that valley toward the only path that offered any hope at all. The climb toward higher ground should have taken less than 5 minutes, but the valley refused to let anyone leave without one final test. Water poured through the broken canyon with enough force to shake the steel support bridge stretching across the floodplain. Every alarm on our rescue vehicles flashed at once. Structural failure was imminent. Most of us stopped moving, convinced the crossing was already lost. Daniel Hayes did not hesitate. He studied the bridge for only a moment before leading the way. The Caraxi followed directly behind him, carrying Lyra with surprising care despite the unstable surface beneath its massive paws. I expected panic from the frightened child, yet she held tightly to the thick fur around the predator's shoulders and never looked away from Daniel. Somehow his calm had become hers. Halfway across the bridge, another security shuttle swept overhead, lowering directly into their path. Its engines blasted rain and mist across the narrow structure, forcing everyone to shield their eyes. The commander stepped into the open doorway once again. His expression no longer carried authority. It carried urgency. "Human," he called out. "Hand over the girl and the data capsule. You cannot protect them forever." Daniel kept walking. "Maybe not forever," he answered without looking back. "Long enough." The commander gave a sharp signal. 2 portable emitter units were activated on opposite ends of the bridge. A low vibration rolled through the air, barely noticeable to most of us. The effect on the Caraxi was immediate. The great predator slowed, lowered its head, and struggled to keep its footing as the invisible frequency spread across the bridge. Several officers smiled with relief. They believed the situation was finally under control. Daniel noticed something different. He knelt beside the Caraxi, placed one steady hand against its neck, and listened. Not to the growl, to the rhythm beneath it. His eyes shifted toward the emitters. "It is not afraid," he said quietly. "It is being forced down." Without another word, he stood, grabbed a loose maintenance cable hanging beneath the bridge rail, and swung himself onto the narrow service beam running along the outside edge of the structure. Wind and rain battered him from every direction, but his movements remained precise. He reached the nearest emitter, disconnected its power line with a rescue cutter, and the heavy vibration disappeared almost instantly. The Caraxi lifted its head again as though waking from a nightmare. Before the second emitter could increase its output, Daniel crossed the remaining distance along the steel framework and disabled that unit as well. He never struck a single officer. He simply removed the machines controlling the situation. The bridge fell silent except for the storm itself. The commander stared at him in complete disbelief. Whatever strategy had been prepared depended on overwhelming strength and superior technology. Neither had mattered. Daniel climbed back onto the bridge deck, checked Lyra's safety straps, then nodded once toward the Caraxi. The enormous predator rose to its full height and continued forward with quiet confidence, ignoring every armed officer standing nearby. None of them dared move aside because of fear alone. They stepped aside because, for the first time, they understood they were looking at someone who could read danger faster than they could create it, and every choice he made kept more lives safe than their orders ever had. By the time we reached the Emergency Operations Center overlooking the valley, the storm had begun to weaken, but the crisis was only growing larger. Rescue crews rushed between damaged vehicles, while engineers struggled to restore communication arrays that had been knocked offline by the flood. Daniel Hayes ignored every distraction. His attention remained on Lyra and the crystal data capsule she had trusted him to protect. The Caraxi stayed close enough that every nervous officer kept one hand near a restraint device, yet not a single person dared approach after everything they had witnessed at the bridge. I noticed something else that none of the command staff seemed willing to acknowledge. The Predator never watched the soldiers. It watched Daniel. Every time he changed direction, the Caraxi adjusted its position without hesitation. Not because it had been trained, but because trust had quietly replaced fear. Lyra finally regained enough strength to stand on her own. Daniel offered her a bottle of clean drinking water from his rescue pack and waited patiently while she caught her breath. Only then did he remove the crystal capsule from his vest. He held it carefully, almost as if he already understood its weight had nothing to do with its size. "Tell me why they want this so badly," he said. Lyra looked around the operations center before lowering her voice. "Because it recorded everything." Daniel remained silent. He never interrupted people who were finally ready to tell the truth. "My father was leading a diplomatic mission," she continued. "We were supposed to meet representatives from Earth to prevent another border conflict. Before we arrived, our escorts suddenly changed course. They claimed there was a security emergency. Then our own protection ships turned their weapons toward us. Even from several yards away, I felt the atmosphere change. Engineers stopped talking. Rescue pilots looked up from damaged equipment. The commander standing near the communications tower slowly backed away without saying a word." Lyra continued. "The recording shows who gave the order. If it becomes public, an entire war will stop before it begins." Daniel studied the capsule for a moment, then looked toward the nearest communication tower rising above the operations center. "Can it transmit?" he asked. Lyra nodded. "If the main array is working." Before anyone could answer, every light inside the operations center flickered. A deep warning tone echoed across the compound as backup generators automatically activated. One of the technicians shouted that the primary communications network had just been locked from an outside source. Large security doors began sliding shut around the facility. The commander was gone. So were several officers who had insisted on taking custody of Lyra only minutes earlier. Daniel did not look surprised. He simply handed the capsule back to Lyra and calmly scanned every entrance to the building. The Caraxi stepped in front of the young girl without making a sound, forming a living shield while keeping its eyes fixed on Daniel instead of the closing doors. I finally understood what separated the human from everyone else around him. We reacted after danger revealed itself. Daniel prepared before anyone else even admitted it existed. As the final security gate locked into place and unfamiliar footsteps echoed through the silent operations center, I realized the flood had never been the greatest threat. It had only been the beginning of something far more carefully planned, and the one person standing between that plan and its success was the quiet human every official had underestimated from the moment he arrived. The unfamiliar footsteps stopped just outside the sealed operations center, but nobody entered. Instead, Every display screen inside the building came to life at the same time. The commander's face appeared across dozens of emergency monitors. The calm confidence he had worn throughout the rescue was gone. In its place was the expression of someone running out of time. "Daniel Hayes," he said, "this does not concern Earth. Give us the child and the diplomatic recorder," and everyone else walks away. Daniel did not even look at the screens. His attention remained on the room itself. He studied the ceiling vents, the maintenance corridors, the emergency exits, and finally the disabled communications console near the center of the operations floor. "If this was only about the recorder," he replied, "you would have cut the power after locking the doors. You left the screens on because you are buying time." The commander's expression hardened. Before he could answer, one of the side maintenance panels slid open. Several armored operatives entered carefully, carrying restraint equipment instead of heavy weapons. They moved with obvious discipline, attempting to surround Daniel without creating panic among the rescue workers trapped inside. Daniel quietly guided Lyra behind a reinforced support column. The Caraxi stepped beside her immediately, its broad frame blocking the narrow approach. Nobody had to tell the Predator where to stand. It already understood exactly who needed protection. One operative advanced with a portable containment shield, hoping to separate Daniel from the child. Daniel waited until the last possible moment, then calmly shifted the shield's direction using its own forward movement. The heavy device locked itself against a storage rack instead of blocking his path. A second operative reached for Daniel's rescue harness, only to find himself gently redirected away before he could secure a grip. Every movement from the human was controlled, efficient, and focused on creating space rather than causing harm. Watching him was like watching someone solve a difficult engineering problem instead of fighting. The remaining operatives slowed immediately. Their carefully rehearsed plan depended on speed and confusion. Daniel had removed both. During the brief pause, Lyra noticed a blinking indicator beneath the silent communications array. "The emergency backup uplink," she whispered. "It still has power." Daniel followed her gaze. The primary system had been locked, but the independent disaster transmitter remained physically connected. It had been designed to survive floods, earthquakes, and complete network failures. It could not be disabled remotely. "Can you activate it?" he asked. Lyra nodded uncertainly. "Only if someone reaches the control panel." The panel sat across the operations floor with several operatives standing between it and the support column. Before anyone else could react, the Caraxi slowly walked away from Lyra and into the center of the room. Every armored operative instinctively turned toward the massive Predator, creating exactly the opening Daniel needed. He crossed the floor in seconds, reached the backup console, restored emergency power, and inserted the crystal recorder into the transmission port. Progress indicators immediately appeared across every display in the building. 10%, 20%, 30%. The commander shouted for the upload to stop, but no one inside the room could reach the console before the system completed its encrypted handshake. For the first time since the flood began, hope spread through the operations center. The truth was no longer trapped inside a single crystal. It was beginning to travel far beyond the valley, and everyone present understood that once the transmission finished, no amount of authority, fear, or carefully planned deception would ever be enough to bury it again. The transmission reached 100% with a single quiet tone that somehow sounded louder than the storm outside. Every monitor inside the operations center went dark for a heartbeat before reconnecting to the planetary emergency network. Then the recording began playing everywhere at once. Rescue stations, government offices, orbital patrol ships, civilian shelters, and diplomatic outposts all received the same unedited message. Lyra's father stood before an official delegation, calmly documenting the sudden change in their escort orders and identifying the officers who had redirected the convoy moments before the attack. No accusations, no speculation, only facts, names, locations, and timestamps that could not be altered. The room around me fell completely silent. Even the operatives who had tried to seize the recorder lowered their heads as the truth spread far beyond anyone's control. The commander stared at the nearest screen without speaking. Every explanation he might have offered disappeared with each passing second of the recording. Daniel Hayes never celebrated. He simply remained beside Lyra, quietly watching to make sure she was safe. The Caraxi stood on her opposite side, alert but calm, as though it understood that the danger was finally beginning to pass. Outside, rescue aircraft that had once surrounded the operations center changed formation. Instead of pointing toward Daniel, they repositioned to secure the perimeter against anyone attempting to escape. New orders were arriving from planetary leadership almost as quickly as the recording reached additional systems. Independent investigators were already on their way. Medical teams entered the building without hesitation, this time carrying only emergency equipment. Nobody asked Daniel to surrender the child. Nobody demanded custody of the Caraxi. The questions had changed completely. They were no longer asking who had caused the crisis. They were asking how one human had uncovered the truth before an entire command structure had admitted it existed. As Lyra was escorted toward the medical station, she paused beside the great predator. She gently rested one hand against its neck. "You kept your promise," she whispered. The Caraxi closed its eyes for a brief moment before turning toward Daniel. What happened next erased the final piece of every story I had ever believed. The most feared predator on our world slowly lowered its head in front of the human. Not out of fear, not because it had been defeated. It was an unmistakable gesture of respect, offered freely and witnessed by every person inside the operations center. Daniel answered with nothing more than a quiet nod before placing one hand against the side of the animal's neck. No triumph, no pride, just mutual understanding. Weeks later, the official investigation confirmed everything contained inside the recording. The diplomatic convoy had been betrayed from within. The flood had been exploited to erase the remaining evidence. The Caraxi had never hunted the survivors. It had guarded the last witness until someone worthy of trust finally arrived. I have replayed that day in my mind more times than I can count. People still ask me when I first realized Daniel Hayes was different from everyone else. They expect me to describe the flooded river, the collapsing bridge, or the impossible rescue beneath the water. They are always surprised by my answer. The moment that changed everything was not when the human saved the predator. It was when the predator decided the human was the safest place to leave the future of an innocent child. We once believed the Caraxi was the most dangerous creature on Vera. After witnessing what happened with my own eyes, I finally understood the truth. The strongest beings in the galaxy are not the ones others fear. They are the ones every frightened soul hopes will arrive before it is too late. And on that storm-covered world, that being was a human named Daniel Hayes.